This is University Lecture.
Welcome to another in a series of lectures given on the campus of Iowa State University in Ames. Today we present the first in a series of programs entitled VISHA 1971, lectures by and about the speakers at this year's VISHA activities at Iowa State. Today, Glenn Smith, professor of education at Iowa State, discusses Max Rafferty on education and Mr. Rafferty's book, Suffer Little Children. Mr. Rafferty's lecture may be heard next week at this same time. Professor Smith.
Actually, I guess I'm reviewing 3 books of Max Rafferty's and 1 book about Max Rafferty. The book which was originally chosen, Suffer Little Children, incidentally it is Suffer Little Children, not Suffer the Little Children. I'm not quite sure what difference the distinction makes, but there is that distinction. For that matter, I'm not quite certain what the title has to do with the book. But that book, Suffer Little Children, was published in 1962. It is now out of print, so you'll have a devil of a time finding it unless you take it from a library someplace. There is a more recent book called What They Are Doing to Your Children, 1964. That one is also out of print. Then in 1968, the original company, Devin Adair, which did Suffer Little Children, came out with a compendium, essentially, of Rafferty's columns. He started in '64 writing a syndicated column for the Los Angeles Times. In 1968, this book came out called Max Rafferty on Education, and that's the only one which is still available through bookstores. Then in '69, a professor of education, as you might suppose, did a little book called Readin', Writin', and Rafferty. His name is William O'Neill, and it is a rather good, brief introduction to the way Rafferty operates and some of the kinds of things he says on a number of major topics. I'd like to spend a little bit of time talking about Rafferty and his background because I think it's much easier to understand what he says, or at least to make sense out of what he says, if you know something about him than if you don't. Somehow the things he writes end up being rather contradictory at times, and it's very, very difficult to understand why he would say one thing and then say another unless you know something about him. He's 61 years old, or at least he will be May the 7th, which is, I think, the day he's scheduled to be here, is it not? Is that right? Well, he'll be 61 that day. He was born in New Orleans, the son of a Roman Catholic Irish father, working class apparently, and a Baptist mother of colonial origins. His mother taught him how to read when he was 3, and he spent a good deal of time with children's classics, I guess you would call them, King Arthur, Robinson Crusoe, and American history books. And you can see a lot of that experience coming through in the things he advocates today for curricular materials in schools. He has satirized, criticized rather savagely the Dick and Jane and similar kinds of readers in schools, and he would like to see substituted in their places things like Robinson Crusoe, King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table, and stories of that kind. He lived in Sioux City with his family for 10 years, from the time he was 4 until he was 14. His father ran a paint and wallpaper store. Apparently that didn't do too well, or I suppose the Depression's coming on probably stopped the progress there, and the family moved to California, to Los Angeles. Max went to Beverly Hills High School. His father worked in a nearby auto shop. While he was there, he was known for his bookishness, his debating skill, and for his youth. He graduated when he was 16, having skipped a couple of grades. Then he went to UCLA, where he took a BA in history with a minor in English. And while he was at UCLA, he managed the football team, had some other athletic connections. I'm not sure that he played or participated in athletics so much as as being a manager on the sideline, as far as I can tell. And he belonged to something called the UCLA Americans, which was an athletic and fraternity frat system group organized to offset the pernicious influence of leftist organizations on campus. I don't know any more about it than that. It sounds a bit like the Young Americans for Freedom or a group of that kind today. I don't know whether it was that strong or not. He graduated with about a C-plus average from UCLA. He worked as a mechanic, I think, for a little while, decided to become a teacher, and he got his teacher's certificate. And he spent the next 21 years in various teaching and administrative jobs in California. He did a master's degree in 1949 from UCLA in school administration. He did an EDD, Doctor of Education degree, in 1956 from the University of Southern California in school administration. I think it may be interesting to notice that he did those particular kinds of degrees in view of the rather strong indictments he makes about education professionally and graduate training in education. There are a good many statements in Rafferty's writings which indicate that he himself is affiliated with the classics and with the true learning of the past rather than the garbage which now is being put forth in colleges of education. But his training is all in the colleges of education. In the late 50s, Rafferty began coming to national attention. He took a job at Needles, California. Incidentally, most of his jobs in California were in small, desert, remote towns. He said they paid better and the advancement was faster there. Well, he took a job in Needles as superintendent of schools, and the Christian Science Monitor did a story on him which caused him to be offered a job in, I suppose this is said, La Cañada, California, as superintendent of schools. There, in 1961, he gave a speech called The Passing of the Patriot, which is apparently the thing which really brought him to everybody's attention. It's a rather impassioned charge that the schools of this country have since the 1930s been doing rather bad things to people because of stressing so-called life adjustment education. I don't know whether you're familiar with that term, life adjustment education, anymore or not. This was popular in the 40s and 50s. There was a good deal said about it in the mid and late 50s by people like Admiral Rickover and James Bryant Conant, who were, at least to some degree, opposed to it. It has ceased to be a term used very much anymore, so you may not have heard of it. I can't really define it for you very exactly. It grew out of the progressive education movement, which grew partly out of the thought of John Dewey and others like him. Rather tenuous connections all the way along in some ways. Life adjustment education is popularly characterized and caricatured as standing for very little in the way of content, so long as the kiddies get along with each other and everyone likes everyone else fairly well, then school must be doing okay. This is the caricature of it, and it's the one which Rafferty essentially utilizes. He has made an evil force out of life adjustment education, which he says the graduate schools and undergraduate schools of education are purveying madly throughout the land, thus corrupting the schools. And this, he says, is the cause of the crisis which we were facing. He's saying this in 1961, talking about oil Sputnik and the defection of some people during the Korean War from the American side to the other side of that conflict. He was playing upon those kinds of things. He said in his speech that the worst of our young people were growing up to be booted, sideburned, duck-tailed, unwashed, leather-jacketed slobs whose favorite sport is ravaging little girls and stomping polio victims to death. And the best of our youth, he said, are coming into the world off of a mad roller coaster ride, dizzy, confused. He said they're coming to maturity with everything blurred, with nothing clear, with everything in doubt. And then he goes on to say, no wonder so many of our people defected during the Korean War. Well, undoubtedly, there's some truth, you see, in what he says. There are leather-jacketed, booted, sideburn, long-haired, duck-tailed, Hell's Angels type people who do sometimes stomp people into the ground. And obviously this is an age of confusion in very many ways. It's not so much that Rafferty is altogether wrong in what he says about the characteristics of the time in which we live. It's what he does with those things after he says them. Well, just a little bit more about his history. He stayed in the job where he gave this speech for about a year, and the speech apparently helped him to become State Superintendent of Public Instruction in California in 1962. That's an elective job. He ran against, or let me say this a different way, almost all of the organized groups, the California Teachers Association, the National Education Association, and other organized units in California opposed Rafferty. He won despite their opposition. He won again in 1966. These are four-year terms. He won decisively by 3 million votes in 1966. He lost, as you may know, in 1970, rather narrowly to the man who was second in command to him in California. In 1968, he also ran for the United States Senate. He unseated Senator Kuchel in California for the Republican nomination, but he lost to, was it Cranston, I believe, was the Democratic nominee who beat Rafferty, not by a wide margin. In the early days of that campaign, Rafferty stressed law and order, violence in the streets, the need for cracking down on all kinds of disruptive elements a great deal. He mollified some as he went along. He mellowed in any case and came out a little less strongly toward the end, but he's definitely on the law and order Spiro Agnew side of the political spectrum, and he was appealing to that part of the vote in California. I think you have to keep in mind that Rafferty is fundamentally a politician, and he says things as a politician would say them. If you try to read him as a scholar, which a good number of people have done, you get into trouble because he won't stick around to fight on scholarly issues. He caricatures John Dewey. He presumably represents the progressive education movement. When you start nitpicking to say, hey, wait a minute, it really didn't say this, John Dewey really didn't say this, he didn't mean this, Rafferty's not interested in that sort of thing. He's already gotten his point across, and he's off to something else. So he's caused a good deal of consternation among the people who've tried to discuss seriously educational philosophy with him, because despite the fact that he seems to like to think of himself as a scholar, he has not written anything that would, by the traditional definitions of scholarship, be styled as a scholarly work, except for a doctoral dissertation, which involved pupil-teacher ratios in selected California counties, I believe. Aside from that, his writings have been of the polemical, bombastic, and political, popular kind, which is really okay. It's just that you need to understand this in dealing with what he's written, because otherwise it's very misleading. I think if you see him as a debater, which he likes to think of himself as, and a politician, not as a scholar or an analytical critic, that helps to make sense of what he says. Also, I think I'm on very shaky ground here, but I'm going to make a guess because I think it's right, and I think it helps make sense of things. I wish I knew Rafferty personally. I'd feel much more secure about saying this. I don't. I guess I will a week from now. It seems to me that he is typical of many very strongly upward mobile people. He comes from, lower middle, upper working class backgrounds. He's fought his way up through the educational system. He's made a place for himself, and at times when I'm reading things he's written, I almost feel like he's stopping and saying, "Hey, Mom, hey, look, see, I really did make it after all." I don't quite know what to do with this. It just seems to me that part of his whole image of himself is tied up with making it, getting there, scoring in competitive athletic terms. And he plugs for competition very, very strongly. He thinks one of the things wrong with American schools today is that they do not have enough competition in them. If they were more competitive, if teachers encouraged more competition, the schools would be much stronger places. And I think part of that thrust must come from his own background and the way he sees himself and the way he feels perhaps his parents see him. Well, enough of this. Let me give you some idea of the things he says. He says there is only one great problem in education today. This is the tragedy of declining standards. Again, if you keep in mind that he's writing in a post-Sputnik period when all of a sudden many people were very concerned that we'd been running schools at great cost for many years for many people, and yet we were turning out a lot of people who were unable to read, write, calculate at the levels which we were beginning to fear were necessary to survive in competition with the Soviet Union, then, this kind of statement makes some sense. How did this happen, he says? We were duped by St. John Dewey and his followers into following the false St. Elmo's fire of pragmatism. The problem is pragmatism, progressivism in the schools. This is the evil. Progressive education, says Rafferty, is a way of thinking and of teaching with which American democracy cannot coexist. Within it lie the seeds of the rumbles and the riots, the frantic search for kicks, the newsstand filth, and the cinematic garbage which mark the last descent into cloying, clinging sickness of ultimate decay by every civilization which has ever permitted this infection to overcome its resistance. Sounds like Billy Graham. In fact, Rafferty once said that his favorite choice for U.S. Commissioner of Education would be Billy Graham. He is a very fundamentalistic man in a lot of ways in the attitudes he expresses. What makes educational progressivism doubly dangerous to Rafferty is the fact that it has weakened, from his point of view, the moral fiber of the nation at the very time when we are opposed by the terrible threat, as he calls it, of a race of faceless, godless peasants from the steppes of Asia. And he has other equally scholarly and dispassionate names for the Russians and the Chinese. He says, a race of faceless, godless peasants from the steppes of Asia strives to reach across our bodies for the prize of world dominion. Progressivism is a recipe for national suicide because it teaches a small fry the supreme virtue of seeking accommodation with those whose sworn, remorseless intention is to destroy us utterly. Well, then he picks up, as illustrative of his conviction, as illustrations of his conviction that times are bad, incidents which may or may not be typical of what is occurring. The Richard Speck situation, you remember the man who murdered, was it 8 student nurses in Chicago? He cites this as evidence that we've really gone a long way down the trail toward not truly being able to defend ourselves. And he asks, how is it that these 8 student nurses permitted themselves to be done in by this man? Well, he concludes, it was because they went to schools which were staffed by people who were fed on John Dewey progressivism, and they therefore were sapped of their abilities to stand up for themselves and what they thought was right. He ignores the fact that 2 of the 8 student nurses were from the Philippines and were not subjected to the bad influence of John Dewey's schools, but this is the kind of basis he uses for his arguments in many cases. He generalizes from 1 or 2 or 3 incidents to then declare, you see, we are really in big trouble, and the problem is progressivism. This is an important part of the Gospel according to St. John Dewey, but it's more than that. Over the long haul of history, it's a recipe for national suicide because it teaches the small fry, again, the supreme virtue of seeking accommodation with those whose sworn remorseless intention is to destroy us utterly. How many of you, just for my own information, how many of you have been following the Iowa State Daily items by Rafferty? How many of you saw the one on progressive education? If you saw that, you have a very good feeling, I think, for the way he writes. Most everything he writes is in this vein. He is, as you recall, those of you who read it, for those of you who didn't, in this particular essay, he is taking Charles Silberman, the author of Crisis in the Classroom, to task for portraying American classrooms in a much too dim light. You see, this is where you get into the curious paradox of Rafferty. He said many very, very critical things about schools, and he thinks they're very bad places, but he despises criticism by people like Silberman because it's the wrong kind. He really gets upset that Silberman sees classrooms as grim, joyless, oppressive places. What Rafferty would like to do, as best I can tell, and I hope this is not unfair to him, is to make them even grimmer, more remorseless, more joyless places in the name of improving instruction. Well, what does Rafferty call for? He wants more homework, and again, you see, he's writing in a period, this is much of this 9 years ago, he's writing in a period when there wasn't as much homework as there has come to be since that time, but he sees the schools as being much too soft. He wants more ability, homogeneous grouping in the schools, and here's, I think, an interesting illustration of the way Rafferty uses history. He says in 1962 that we, until about 4 years before that, really didn't have homogeneous grouping. It was only when James Bryant Conant came along and pointed out that we needed this kind of thing that we got it. Well, this is bullshit. We've had homogeneous grouping in this country since the 30s. That movement stretches all the way from the 20s right through the 50s when he was writing. So, you know, he does misuse history in a sense. You would think from reading what he said that we hadn't even bothered to try homogeneous grouping until about 1956, and then the ex-president of Harvard called to our attention the necessity for doing it, and we tried it and found it worked beautifully. Lo and behold, why haven't we had it all along? Well, in addition to homework and more ability grouping, he wants more competition, as I said earlier. School should be, as he puts it, quote, preparation for the jungle that is 20th century life, close quotation, by having more competition. The world is competitive, let's get more competition into the schools. He also wants more discipline in the schools, and let me read you a few things he says about discipline. The only way society has ever found to discourage misconduct is to label it clearly as either a crime or a sin, or both, and then punish it accordingly. Self-discipline in a classroom tends to break down very quickly into 30-odd different types of behavior, ranging from the angelic to the outrageous, depending upon the temperament and training of each individual member. A child usually has neither the maturity nor the judgment to understand the need for self-discipline. Too many instructors compromise themselves in their careers in a hopeless attempt to convince some freckle-faced urchin that he must discipline himself when all he really needs is a session after school with a ruler. Well, you see, again, there's truth in what he says. Obviously, there are times when you're dealing with a group of people when you may not sit down and leave every choice up to the individual in the group. But I think you can see what the basic appeal of this sort of thing is going to be. harass school teachers who are tired of fighting their kids who don't like them too well in some cases anyway are definitely going to identify with this and say, yeah, that's right. And I can think of about 6 who I'd like to take the ruler to after school. Rafferty's whole thrust is in the direction of relatively simple solutions of this kind, more discipline, more homework, more grouping, so that it looks as though he's got the answers to the very complicated dilemmas of mass schooling, something which in fact has never been tried on quite the same scale to quite the same extent by quite as many people before in history. It seems as though he has the answers, and especially for anyone who is tired of uncertainty, who is tired of perplexity, who is threatened by the Hells Angels, by long-haired people, by anyone who is saying things with which they disagree, by pornography or obscenity or whatever. Rafferty has a great deal of appeal, and he is definitely writing out of a fundamentalist tradition. School is not a freak show, nor is it a place to indulge distracting whims and croquettes. Even Abe Lincoln didn't grow a beard until after he was elected president. Our youngsters have all to be in school and of necessity inflict themselves upon each other. They are there to learn, not to show off. Again, what he doesn't say may be more important than what he does say here. Well, finally, another thing he calls for is teachers with more subject matter preparation. And again, you see, this is something with which one can sympathize very readily, because there are obviously a number of teachers floating around in the school systems of this country who don't know what they're talking about and when it comes to teaching some subjects. There are people teaching in the wrong fields. There are people who are ill-prepared in a number of cases. So, you can very readily agree that if you're going to learn French, why not learn it from somebody who knows French well, rather than from somebody who half knows French, but who gets along with kids nicely. I mean, it's hard to argue with this sort of thing. It's again, what he does with it. There is one other thing which keeps cropping up in Rafferty's writings, and that is something which he keeps alluding to as culture. I'm not quite sure what he means by the term. He believes that the reason, or one reason, for the bad image of public schooling today is that superintendents, principals, and teachers have ceased to be well-rounded culturally, that they have become experts, in the case of superintendents, in computer programming or in public relations or in budgetary matters, but they no longer can quote Plato, they no longer have read Schiller, Fichte, and Kant in German, they don't know Latin anymore, and hence they have lost their place of public esteem as one of the leaders of the community. I suspect, and this is why I was saying to you earlier that item about Rafferty's upward mobility and family background, I suspect he is talking more about his own need for recognition as a man of culture and learning when he talks about this sort of thing than he is spelling out a real diagnosis of a problem and a real solution of those problems in the 20th century. He does say that giving up the teaching of Latin was one of the worst mistakes we ever made. And if you have any influence on your schools, go back and try to get them to teach Latin again, because that is the only true subject for learning how to think. Naturally, Max Rafferty took Latin, and he knows how to think. Well, it's difficult to tag Rafferty. I might point out one other thing to those of you who anticipate possibly reading one of his books. He writes in a peculiar style. Apparently, he chooses large, little-known words in place of small, useful daily words wherever he has that choice. And he utilizes in a rather extreme way, alliteration. I don't know if you've seen that in the 3 items in the newspaper or not. I do recall his talking about something spreading across the country like malignant margarine. I don't know what malignant margarine is, frankly. Well, he uses a lot of alliteration. Let me give you one other example. He speaks of the fairy wands in the form of fruity phrases. It's hard to read him out loud because your lips tumble over each other trying to get the alliterations out. I'm uncertain whether he does this on purpose or whether it is a natural thing that sneaks out of his unconscious, but in any case, he does write in a peculiar style. It's a bit bombastic. It seems to me a bit pretentious, although it may not in fact be. This may be the way he really is and the way he talks. Well, as I'm sure you can tell, I disapprove of a number of the things Rafferty says. I'm afraid I'm being a bit unfair to him. I suspect that he is a very attractive, dynamic, and polished man. I do not know him personally. I have been told by people who do that he is a superb debater, that he relishes debate, revels in it, loves it, that he likes to put an opponent down, and that in fact he knows all of the tactics for doing this. And in reading what he has written, I'm not too surprised to hear that. I suspect it is true. Other people have also said of him, though, in fairness, that he is a very kind and pleasant man, off stage in any case, that he can be quite self-effacing, and that he is certainly no racist, and probably not as politically an obscurantist as he sounds in some cases. I'm tempted to say that he is to education what Barry Goldwater is to politics. I don't know whether that's entirely accurate. I think he would be a man very well worth hearing, although he is largely charging windmills that ceased to exist a number of years ago. From my point of view, I think he is mostly beside the point in his criticisms and his solutions, particularly in his solutions. But in any case, he is a man who obviously taps a great deal of the sentiment of the country. On the question, for example, of discipline, well over half the population agrees with him that what the public schools need is more strong discipline. I think he's going to say some very irritating things to many of you and to me. Well, he already does say a number of irritating things to me in the things he has written. I think it'll be interesting to watch him to see what political and educational directions he takes after this. He's such a contradictory man. He calls for example, he calls for logic in the schools and dispassionate reasoning. This is what he truly wants the schools to do, is to teach people how to think clearly. And yet, he believes the schools should inculcate patriotism in the most unquestioning way possible. He is thoroughly out of sympathy with the view, my country if it's right, but I'm going to oppose it if it's wrong. He believes completely, my country right or wrong, no matter how wrong, at all times you stand up for your country blindly and passionately and zealously, and you love it as you would your mother if you've never broken from home. This is the kind of thing he seems to say. So you see, you get these kinds of contradictions going. He's a man who has very strong beliefs, who does seem to me to contradict himself, although most of us do. He's a man who stands for a lot of things which the far right has been able to identify with. For example, H.L. Hunt's program Lifelines has frequently quoted from Rafferty and has published things by him. And yet, I think it would be very unfair to call him a John Bircher or necessarily a man of the far right. He's a complicated man. He's a contradictory man. Apparently, he's also a charming and interesting and pleasant man in many ways. I won't necessarily encourage you to read his books, but they're there. They do speak about part of the American experience, part of the American commitment, part of the American feeling of the present time. It's one way of getting at part of the sentiment, which is certainly a manifestation of our time. Thank you very much.
Following Professor Smith's talk, several questions were asked from the audience, including, do you feel that a lot of Dr. Rafferty's appeal comes from the fact that only in the field of education does the common citizen feel inclined to put in his 2 cents worth?
Well, yes, I think there's definitely a factor there. People are very concerned about schools, and almost all of us believe that we know what's best when it comes to schooling. And so, perhaps rightly so, people feel they have the right to speak up about what they want in their schools. I don't know how you get around this in a country with popular government.
The same person then asked about the problems schools have getting stuck with jobs parents are not able or unwilling to do. For example, the unruly child.
Well, incidentally, this is one of the criticisms Rafferty makes, rather pointedly. He says the schools have taken on all kinds of things which they ought not to have done, and he includes driver's education, the whole socializing process as part of the criticism. He says schools are there to teach. That's all they're there for, just to teach math, physics, chemistry, Spanish, whatever is to be taught. Well, it's hard to know how to respond to this whole area of what should the schools be doing. Obviously, the world in 1971 is not the same as it was in 1900 when that philosophy was prevalent. That's really all the schools did do in 1900 was to teach certain subject matter. And the increasing specialization of social agencies, the increasing pressure to keep people off the streets while Mother and Daddy work certainly has been a major factor in causing the schools to be what they are. But I think, you see, it's one thing to make the criticism, to say, after all, folks, let's look here and see that the school is supposed to look after the health, the mental health, the morals, the manners, the deportment, the intellectual development, the social development of everyone. I mean, that's an enormous task, which it is. It's one thing to make that criticism, and quite another to decide what to do about it, because we don't need people holding jobs like we used to need them. Someone is going to be taking on the specialized functions, and we have dumped these on the school, it's true, very unconsciously without taking a very hard look at what we're doing. But it's a very hard thing to decide how to solve it when you're going to keep all of the age group from 0 through 20 out of the workforce. Where do you put people and what do you do with them? This is the whole dilemma which we're facing, and I don't think people like Rafferty have any solutions to it. They're only aware that it makes it an impossible task for the schools, which it does, but then deciding that some people don't need to go to school all those years, maybe that nobody needs to go to school all those years unless he wants to. This gets into a whole other area that Rafferty really doesn't deal with, as far as I can tell.
What caused Rafferty to lose in his bid for re-election to the California Board of Education?
I really don't know what caused him to lose. He lost very narrowly. He lost to a very moderate, middle-aged, well-liked, black second in command. I don't know whether there were a sufficient number of people suddenly fed up with Rafferty in California. You see, he lost the Senate election, too, 2 years before that time. And it looks as though there must have been some kind of shift in California attitudes between 1966 and 1970, because he won by such an overwhelming landslide in 66. Then he lost in 68 in the Senate race, and then he lost in 70. And I don't know what to ascribe the loss to, frankly.
Another questioner asked, does the fact that California has free higher education have anything to do with Rafferty losing in his bid for re-election?
Well, I really don't know. California has always been noted for being slightly different from the norm when it came to schools. Not only the private free schools, but then the whole public school system was supposed to have been more progressive and more open and so on than many other parts of the country. I really don't know that that has anything to do with it. California is a curious state because there's so many people from Oklahoma and Arkansas in California that you get very strong, fundamentalist, conservative, politically, religiously, socially groups going there. And of course, you can look at Orange County and Los Angeles, and you've got almost a schizophrenic state in a way. You've got every extreme you can imagine. I really doubt that the existence of free schools in California has that much to do with Rafferty's loss. I'm not that conversant with the educational political philosophy of his successor, but I have the feeling that his successor, while more moderate sounding and probably less antagonistic toward the so-called educational establishment, is probably not that different in some ways from what Rafferty did. Actually, Rafferty never had a whole lot of impact on what the schools ended up doing in California. This is the curious thing. He was relatively powerless to affect major curricular changes. He did get the adoption of a music book in elementary school containing Columbia, Gem of the Ocean, and some other patriotic songs, which he would approve of. He fought a losing battle, or at least it looks like a losing battle, to keep the Dictionary of Unconventional English and Slang out of libraries in California. It's hard to know in those things who loses and who wins, because even though the book stayed in most of the libraries, I'm sure there are a lot of librarians who got scared and didn't buy it because of all the publicity that took place. But actually, the school system just rocked right along. You get a massive bureaucracy like the State Department of Public Instruction in a state the size of California, and the man at the top can say whatever he pleases, but it doesn't have too much effect on what actually takes place in the classroom. The whole thing reminds me of France in a lot of ways. France is a highly centralized system, and it has a commitment to general culture of the sort that Rafferty wants, and yet the French Ministry of Education can rarely do anything with the schools. They don't change very much because of an order from the ministry. There are a lot of ways that Rafferty and the California system reminds me of France, but I don't really think he ever had that much impact on the actual operation in the classroom. What this thing did for him was to give him a national platform from which to air his views. It gave him a certain amount of legitimacy, I think, as being a chief state school officer from one of the 2 or 3 largest states in the country. It gave him a certain aura which permitted him to speak out forcefully on issues and a platform for doing it, but I don't think he actually had that much impact. Well, like, for example, his second in command has been there for a long time. The third in command, they were probably having more to do with the way the schools operated than Rafferty was. I mean, he had such massive opposition from within.
Another question was, on Rafferty's style of writing, do you think he actually cares about and believes in what he writes, or is it a means to his political goals?
Well, I think he cared. I think he was also being a politician and trying to win an audience. I think he has a very keen sense of audience, and he knows what's bothering people. I'm not accusing him of telling lies or of not believing what he's saying, but I think he says what he says the way he says it, partly because he knows what people want to hear. So I think there's a fairly strong political overtone in it,
Still another question, does that go for his patriotism, too?
I don't really know. I suspect it might. He did not serve in World War II. He had flat feet. So, it always makes you wonder a little bit about a man who never served, who is really gung-ho to have people get in and shoot and die and kill. This doesn't necessarily mean that he is insincere in what he believes. I guess it would take on more force if he'd been a Marine captain or corporal or something on Guadalcanal.
Another listener asked, do you have any comments on Rafferty's speech, An American Pleads Not Guilty, the speech having to do with Vietnam, drugs, pollution, and so forth?
Well, all I think I can say about it is that it's illustrative of the way Rafferty thinks. he represents a style of thought which is fairly common in this country, and that goes essentially like that. We produced atomic bombs and we dropped a couple, but we really don't have any moral problems over that. We turn out all kinds of technological products which pollute the environment, but that's really not our fault. You know, let's don't find fault with things. It's kind of the old Reader's Digest attitude of, after all, there are little problems with the world, but it's not so bad. You know, look around, we're all eating well. The sun comes up every day. My car starts 25 mornings out of 26. It's really not a bad world. You see, my kids are going to college. I got a new suit last month. I'm going to get a raise next month. It's really not such a bad world. If everybody will just kind of be calm, shave their beards, cut their hair, be respectful, pray a little, work hard, save their money. The good old virtues. Whatever happened to the good old virtues? And so, you know, this is the kind of thought which many people take comfort in, and I think Rafferty's one of them. I don't know, it's hard to argue against that kind of thing quickly, because it represents an emotional commitment which is very deep-seated in people, and it's a search for comfort, for a way of feeling good about ourselves. And I should think, from the way Rafferty sounds, he must feel damn good about himself. He must really like the way he feels about the world, which is, after all, kind of nice. You know, you hate to go around wrecking that sort of thing for yourself or anybody else. I think he is shot full of contradictions if you look at it logically. He seems to believe that truth is what he feels strongly about. Of course, he's not that different from a lot of university professors in that regard. I have very many colleagues and friends who would fall on the opposite side of the political spectrum, but who nevertheless regard truth as, you know, whatever they believe strongly. I guess we all do, for that matter. We're all contradictory in some ways. But he is this kind of fellow who says a lot of things that don't necessarily follow through and make sense.
Finally, a listener asked, I imagine he's vehemently opposed to the Summerhill School.
Yeah, as a matter of fact, he says about Summerhill, I don't know how many of you are familiar with Summerhill, some of you I know from seeing your faces, but he says that he would as soon enroll a child of his in a brothel as in Summerhill. And again, you see, you get a flavor for the man. This is the way he writes. This is the way he thinks. Summerhill is a totally evil place.
You have been listening to another in a series of lectures given on the campus of Iowa State University in Ames. Today, you heard the first in a series of programs entitled VISHA 1971, lectures by and about the speakers at this year's VISHA activities here at Iowa State. Today, Glenn Smith, professor of education, discussed Max Rafferty on education and Mr. Rafferty's book, Suffer Little Children. Mr. Rafferty's lecture may be heard next week at this same time. University Lecture is a presentation of Iowa State University Radio.